so never mind.
Was there as well, and I'm very glad for this work that you're doing. I thought I might just talk for a few minutes, if that makes sense, about where we stand right now, because I think it's an extremely interesting moment in our history. As everyone knows, there have been a series of reasons why it's become increasingly obvious that we'd be better off getting humans off fossil fuel sooner rather than later. One of those we've known about for centuries. When you burn stuff, you give off smoke and particulates that interact badly with the human body. And this problem has grown and grown and grown. We finally have a full-blown study from last year, meta-study around the world demonstrating that breathing the byproducts of fossil fuel combustion kills 9 million human beings a year. 9 million, for reference, turns out to be a lot. It's more than died from COVID, HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, war, and terrorism last year. It's the third leading cause of death on the planet, accounting for 1 death in 5. That's simply breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. The second reason we've known about, not for centuries, but for decades, and that, of course, is the overriding existential dilemma posed by climate change. This is what I've spent my life working on, and I'm sure many of you. And having written the first book about it back in 1989, I will say mostly that the things that scientists were warning about 3 decades ago are the things that are coming true today. I wake up on the North American continent this morning. We have about half the population under an extreme heat warning that stretches almost from one coast to the other. In the middle of that, we have the largest forest fires going on in several American states. Meanwhile, in Yellowstone Park, perhaps the most beloved landscape in America, flooding so terrible from record rainstorms that they've closed all entrances in and most of the roads have washed out. And that's just an average day anymore in the climate saga on one small corner of the planet. The US suffers, but it does not suffer as badly as many other places. As you know, we're in a horrific drought across much of Africa that's lasted 4 years now and is endangering, it's already killed many people and endangering hundreds of thousands of more people as we speak. It's always worth remembering that the entire continent of Africa has put only about 2% of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So as usual, destruction is following the iron law of global warming. The less you've done to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit. I could go on about the perils of climate change all day. I don't think I need to. This is by far the biggest thing that human beings have ever done. We're now melting the Arctic, raising the oceans, and fundamentally altering the hydrological balance of the planet. Since warm air holds more water vapor than cold, we see big increases both in evaporation in arid areas and precipitation in wet areas. And that's playing havoc even at the fairly limited level of a 1 degree Celsius increase in global average temperature. Of course, the horror that we face is that we're on a trajectory to raise the temperature nearly 3 degrees. And if we do that, then I think that the evidence is becoming increasingly clear. It will strain us to support civilizations like the ones we're used to. The level of violent flux and chaos simply too high. So the extraordinary amount of work that's being done in engineering labs, in civil society, in international diplomacy is, of course, somehow to hold that rise to 2 degrees or less, 1.5. Um, and 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 that is extraordinarily noble and extraordinarily frustrating work. But there's probably never been a more important human task than that. So two. That's the second reason that we'd be well advised to get off fossil fuel. The third, and the one that's come into focus this year again, is the interesting connection between fossil fuel and autocracy, or really at the moment, fascism. Remember the physical properties of fossil fuel. It's concentrated in a few places, a few deposits around the world. Therefore, the people who control those deposits end up with a great amount of unearned political and economic power. That's why people pay attention to the king of Saudi Arabia. Not because he's got something interesting to say about the world. This is a man that cuts people's heads off with the sword. But because he sits atop a vast pool of oil. That's why in my country, the Koch brothers, our biggest oil and gas barons, amassed funding enough to buy one of our political parties and deform and degrade our political system. And that's why, as everybody knows, this year, Vladimir Putin possessed the resources and the gall to invade Ukraine. 60% of his export earnings come from oil and gas. Without that, he'd be unable to mount a major army. If you don't believe me, go search your house for something made in Russia that you might want to boycott out of anger. Unless there's an old bottle of Stolichnaya vodka sitting in your liquor cabinet, I suggest you won't find anything. And of course, it's the threat to turn off the gas tap to Western Europe that Putin has skillfully used for 2 decades to cower opposition, even as his brutality has become more and more apparent. So we have 3 strong reasons, it seems to me, to want to get off fossil fuel as fast as is possible. 1 is the human health effects, 2 is the climate, and 3 is the threat to our political systems that fossil-fueled autocracies represent. We have 1 real solution that we can implement quickly because it's on-the-shelf technology that's at a price we can afford. And that solution is a rapid energy transition, mostly to renewable energy, to sun, to wind. These things are, as we now know, technically possible, combined with batteries and combined with hydropower and combined with other things around the margins, to produce extraordinary amounts of power. Mark Jacobson lab at Stanford has put out a plan for every state in America and every country in the world that allows for rapid conversion to water and wind and sun by 2030 or 2035. That technical possibility, of course, is made real over the last decade by that dramatic fall in the price of renewable energy, down 90% over the last 10 years, something that we have to give enormous thanks to engineers and scientists for, because it makes what's long been necessary at least financially imaginable. In fact, the first really big study we have of this from Oxford's Martin Institute last year, a study mostly of learning curves and what they can tell us about future prices, concluded that a rapid transition to renewable energy, if we could pull one off, would be ideal not only in saving the climate and these other things, but also because it would save us tens of trillions of dollars. And the reason for that isn't obvious at first blush. It's obviously going to cost us money to make this transition, but the payback, they conclude, they calculate, comes much more quickly than people had imagined, mostly because you're no longer having to pay for ongoing deliveries of fossil fuel. The thing to remember about renewable energy is um, once you've built your solar panel, the sun delivers the energy for free every morning when it rises above the horizon. You don't burn up the solar panel and then have to go build a new one, but that's precisely what you do with coal and gas and oil. So that's the good news. But obviously, that transition's not happening, or at least not happening at anything like the pace, the forced pace we need it to happen. As Václav Smil has demonstrated, I think, conclusively and powerfully again and again, energy transitions, at least left to their own devices, take a long time, a couple of generations, because there's lots and lots of already built and paid for assets to replace. And obviously, replacing them slowly and over time is the preferable solution here, um, because it's cheaper and less traumatic and happens more or less naturally by the laws of economics. Our problem is that the laws of physics trump the laws of economics, and we've been told in no uncertain terms that we have to move very fast. The IPCC has given us until 2030 to cut emissions in half if we wish to have a reasonable chance of meeting the temperature targets we set in Paris. Paris was 7 years ago. 2030 is 7 years hence. We're halfway there and not making the progress that we need to be making. And of course, the reason that we're not making the progress is that not everybody is helping. In fact, the fossil fuel industry, desperate to hold on to its business model, is doing everything it can to slow this transition, prevent it from happening. Case in point, before the US Congress at the moment is the first serious climate legislation that it would ever have passed in the 30 plus years since Jim Hansen first testified to the Congress that global warming was real, thus setting off the worldwide attempt to do something about this crisis. That something that Congress might pass, the Build Back Better Act, has hundreds of billions of dollars to help force the pace of this transition. But it's being held up by one man, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, and that one man is holding it up because he's taken more money from the fossil fuel industry than any other politician in Washington. That's a difficult contest to win, but he's won it, and their return on investment is staggering. Some of you may recall the hidden camera video last summer that caught the chief lobbyist from Exxon explaining that Joe Manchin was their kingmaker and that they met with him weekly to make sure that what's happening is happening. At that kind of rate of interference and delay, we will not make this transition happen in time to do anything serious about climate change, nor to do any damage to people like Vladimir Putin. So the question is, could we force the pace if we wanted to? Are there ways to make technological change happen fast? And the answer to that is who knows? We've tried rarely, but the one case that offers a plausible and hopeful look is really the change in industrial policy the last time that fascism threatened Europe in the middle of the 20th century. And at that point in time, America did a remarkable job of remaking itself in the course of a few months to be what was called the arsenal for democracy and provide the materiel that won the Second World War. Others did most of the fighting, but America did most of the supplying. And the sheer scale of the transition and the way that we worked was completely remarkable. I did some reporting years ago about just how fast that went, and people don't, I think, really understand the speed at which we worked. In 1941, the world's largest industrial plant under a single roof went up in 6 months in Michigan. Lindbergh called it the Grand Canyon of the mechanized world. And within months, it was churning out a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. Bombers are big, complicated machines, more than 1 million parts, more than 300,000 rivets. They're really more intricate than solar panels or turbine blades. Elsewhere in Michigan, the Army built a tank factory faster than they could build a power plant to run it. So they simply towed a steam locomotive into one end of the building to provide heat and electricity. That one factory produced more tanks than the Germans built in the entire course of the war. And the whole rest of industry retooled itself in the same way. Not far away in Michigan, a radiator company transformed its business to make 20 million steel helmets. Not far from that, a rubber factory produced millions of helmet liners. The companies that used to supply fabric for Ford's seat cushions went into parachute production. On and on and on and on. And that was guided, of course, by informed government policy. In essence, wartime allowed the government to set real targets and mandate production of that kind. That's possible to imagine happening again. Indeed, we see it in just the tiniest ways now starting. February 27th, 3 days after the invasion of Ukraine, I wrote a piece calling for President Biden to invoke the Defense Production Act in order to speed the production of heat pumps, this most remarkable of technologies that allows the low energy conversion of heat from the ambient air to heat one's home. The argument being that if one could get the numbers fast, it would take some of the edge off Putin's threats to turn off the gas, or if one could deploy them in big numbers in a place like the US, it would at least at the margins begin to cut the price of oil, and hence the windfall that Putin enjoys at the moment that helps his war machine. And I'm pleased to say that moving at lightning speed for Washington these days, last week the Biden administration, in fact, did invoke the Defense Production Act precisely to build heat pumps. I think that they'll mostly stay domestically at the moment, but that's all right. As you all know, the price of oil is globally sad. So every bit helps. This is a very small example of just how nimbly we could move if we wanted to, and we need to. As my friend Svetlana Romanko has reminded people over and over again from Ukraine in the last few months, fossil fuel has become, among other things, a weapon of mass destruction, and so the time to move is now. Thank you all very much.
So, Bill, I'm going to open this to the floor, but I first want to ask one question of my own, and then one that's come in over Twitter. So my own question is, you're something of a Cassandra. You started in 1989 with your book Nature, talking about these issues. It's more than 30 years ago. And then in 2019, the book Falter raised again. And between those years, you've kept reminding us of the issues that lie ahead. What keeps you going? What technologies do you see that, you've spoken a little bit about this, that really lend you hope as we move ahead?
That's a good question. What keeps me moving mostly is watching the rapid growth of citizen movements to demand change. We sort of built the first one at 350.org, the first iteration of a global climate campaign. And we've had our successes blocking the Keystone Pipeline or kicking off this massive fossil fuel divestment campaign that's now at about $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested. But mostly it's been fun to watch others flood into this same space. Mostly young people, it must be said. Sunrise Project in this country, or Greta's enormous work emulated by the tens of thousands of Gretas that are around the planet now, and there are tens of millions of followers. We're now organizing here in the States for people over the age of 60. We're calling it Third Act, because we need old people like me backing up young people as they do their work. We have both the political and financial power to make it happen. So to answer the second half of that question in the same way, the technology that interests me most is not the solar panel, nor the wind turbine, nor the battery, though I think all of those are great, but the technology of movement building, the technology of nonviolent social movements that Gandhi and Dr. King and the suffragettes and others bequeathed us in the 20th century, and that we now need to develop at light speed in order to press as fast as we can for these changes we so desperately need.
And the question that's come in over Twitter is, you've talked about solar panels and the ability to have greater independence, and I know you live in that way. The question that's come in is, can energy independence be achieved by people living in big cities?
Sure. In fact, I mean, in some ways, that's the easiest place to do this because cities are inherently more efficient. There's probably not enough roof space in New York City to provide all the power that it needs, but that's all right. There's, not enough, you can't grow all the food that New York City needs within its borders either. But we could do a much more regionalized job of supplying both food and energy, and we'd be happier for it.
Okay, I'm going to open to the floor now because I know there's some enthusiasm from other people around. Who was the first question? Daniel.
One of the challenges is you talk about how there was a war effort and you could build a bomber every hour, I think you were saying, and there was a great collective understanding that we needed to come together to face this and build this together. Now, when you say we need to build 15 nuclear plants or wind turbines on Cape Cod or things, it's much more fragmented. There are obviously benefits of them, and a lot of people are concerned together. How do you and building stuff in around the world, and I'm particularly talking about America, has a lot of environmental permitting, a lot of care for things. How do you balance the need for speed, the need to not have other environmental impacts that you don't want, but also build again to solve these challenges?
Right. Very good questions, and ones that people have been addressing more and more in recent weeks. And I commend to you Ezra Klein's recent work in the New York Times, for instance, on these questions. It's worth remembering that it wasn't easy to do this back in wartime, in the Second World War. To get done what he did, FDR had to overcome incredible opposition from many of the same players that are providing the opposition here. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce was harshly opposed to lend-lease programs to send material to Europe in the early days of the Second World War. They did everything they could to stop it, arguing that it wasn't their fight. And that it would hurt U.S. business. Ironically, of course, since it turns out nothing ever helped anybody's economy more than what happened in the U.S. During the Second World War. But it was wartime that allowed us to take a different look at things. And one assumes that it's something that looks like war that allows us to have some kind of change here. And the argument I'm trying to make is that we're at that someplace that looks like war, and we should really start to realize it. Not only do we have the war in Ukraine, but in fact, we're fighting what amounts to an ongoing war with physics at the moment, and we are losing. We lose land every day, just as Ukraine loses territory to Russia. We lose territory to rising seas, to expanding wildfires, to rapidly melting permafrost that makes settlements unstable across the north. We're literally losing entire island nations as they begin to sink beneath the waves. So this is, in essence, a war. And the sooner we understand that, the better. The good news about this war is that for the most part, we fight it not by killing other people, but by helping other people and on a global and coordinated basis. It might be easier if it was the kind of traditional kind of war, because humans have proved that when the object is to obliterate an actual other human enemy, we can rouse ourselves to do almost anything. Now we have to figure out if we've evolved to the point where the same is true for the kind of very real but different war that we're fighting now.
Bill, I have another question. Oh, I can see one from Charlie Bolden, former NASA administrator, so we'll go over to him now.
Bill, I'm pleading for help. How do we teach Americans mainly, but everybody in the world, that we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time? And while we look at present day challenges, unless we look to the future and anticipate what we're going to need and begin to build the infrastructure for it, begin to build the capability for it, we're going to find ourselves constantly in the situation where we're always behind.
Right. Well, the sadness at the moment is we're neither walking nor chewing gum. And so, I mean, let's define our terms. Walking means deploying off-the-shelf available technology at speed over the next, let's say, 7 years to 2030. And chewing gum means that during those same 7 years, we're laying the research foundation and engineering foundation for what we're going to need in the out years after 2030. And that means investing serious money to see what we can do in terms of, hydrogen for steel or long distance travel, carbon capture if it turns out to be more than a figment of the imagination, on and on and on. But the thing to remember is, if we don't do the work to do the deployment of the renewable energy we have now by 2030, we're going to get there, and we're going to, much of the rest of it's going to be moot, because we will have done so much destruction, we will have allowed so much destruction that it will be essentially unrecoverable. So that deployment of what we've got on hand right now strikes me as absolutely job one, but there's no reason that it can't coexist with doing necessary research on what's to come next, the stuff we need going forward. The only caution I would add is that there are forces in our society, again, mostly concentrated in the fossil fuel sector, that would like to use the promise of that research to avoid, they'd like to sit chewing gum placidly and not get up and walk around at all. And they use the prospect of the glories to come to keep us from the labors of today.
Phil Lader.
Bill, a derivative two-part question, probably irreverent, I say with apologies. On the premise, not necessarily mine, but one of even people who have leadership roles in this movement, is that net zero is a noble and necessary aspiration, but is unlikely to be achieved in the lifetimes of anybody in this room. And if that is the case, why do we not pay more attention to coping with the reality of climate change, as opposed to the aspirational concentration of essentially looking to net zero? And the second part of the question is, even if you were not to accept that premise, and I'll be interested in your reaction to it, what are the technologies that perhaps we should be deploying to address the reality of climate change, which may be a reality for the next century?
Right. So the question falls on what in the literarily challenged world of climate policy we've come to call adaptation and mitigation. And the argument is, and you make as a strong one, since we're not going to entirely mitigate what's going on with the rise in temperature, shouldn't we be focused on adaptation as well to ameliorate what's coming that we can no longer prevent? And of course, the answer is yes, but let's be clear. we're talking about raising the temperature on current trajectories 3 degrees Celsius, 5, 6 degrees Fahrenheit. And if we do that, there doesn't promise to be any amount of adaptation that will suffice to deal with that kind of change. I mean, the UN has estimated that that produces something like 1 billion climate refugees potentially. Think about the struggle the world has to deal with the 4 million refugees that have come out of Ukraine, and now multiply it by 250 and try to imagine the security implications, the economic implications for that kind of world. The latest economic estimate I've seen for damage from by centuries end from unchecked global warming of that kind is $550 trillion, which is more money than currently exists on our planet. So the point is that rapid mitigation at the moment is probably the best adaptation strategy that we have, because it may hold temperature increases to levels that don't do civilizational survival level damage. That is to say, scrambling now to hold the increase in temperature to as close as 1.5 degrees as is still possible, in essence is an adaptation strategy. Past that, since we obviously, people are already suffering, we have no choice but to try and do serious efforts to ameliorate that suffering and to keep it from getting worse than it has to get. But I guess good news in this case is that this is the stuff that human beings do automatically. If your city is threatened by rising sea level, then you do the hard lobbying work to make sure that someone goes and builds a seawall to protect it. And indeed, the otherwise completely dysfunctional US Congress just approved tens of billions of dollars to build a seawall around Galveston, Texas, because it's the next in line of threatened cities in our country. But as I say, there are profound limits to that. There doesn't look to be any way to build a seawall around Miami. It's made out of limestone, out of the wrong stuff. And there's not a way to build a fire break that can keep huge, raging firestorms from whipping across the American West, and on and on and on. So again, mitigation is adaptation in at least over the next period of time, the next 7 years. We get to 2030, then we stand up and look around and see where we are, and that where we are guides us to what we have to do next.
I have a question here from Scott Simon, and I'm guessing you two may have spoken before.
Oh, yes. Hi there, Bill.
Hello, Scott. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Good to talk to you again, my friend. Look, I know that both you and I have taken instruction from Gandhi in our lives. The Mahatma would spin a cloak for himself every night before he went to bed as personal discipline. And it wasn't like he couldn't afford a new cloth or someone wouldn't have spun it for him, but he felt it was important to demonstrate personal and individual responsibility. What can we do sitting in this room as individuals that might make a contribution and convince others by example?
Right. So what a good example. Gandhi's spinning, of course, was designed to inspire lots of other Indians to do the same thing, and on a scale large enough to have an economic impact. They wanted to, as it were, bankrupt the mills of Britain in order to put pressure on the imperial power. And something like that is, that's one of the reasons that many of us have, figured out how to run our own lives on solar power and so forth. Our problem here that makes it different from Gandhi's problem, Scott, is simply that one of Gandhi's extraordinary characteristics was patience. And he backed off several times his big campaigns because he thought things were getting out of hand, and just told everybody in India to stand down, and we're going to take a few years and educate ourselves some more about nonviolence and come back and try this again. Our problem is we do not have time. Climate change is the first timed test that human beings have ever come up against. So what that means is, I think, that individual action, though noble in the kind of calisthenic form that you describe, sort of getting ourselves warmed up for action, really isn't how we're going to deal with this. We're past the point where we can make progress on the scale we need, one Tesla at a time, one vegan dinner at a time. So I think the mantra I would use in our situation is, Scott, that the most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to push for basic political and economic shifts that allow us to move at the pace that I've described. And happily, that's the other half of Gandhi's legacy to us. I mean, he, more than anybody else, invented what we'd call the big nonviolent social movement. And he used it brilliantly with politics of gesture and a politics of mass organizing to defeat the biggest imperial power in the world. If he can defeat India, perhaps we can figure out a way together to defeat Exxon before it breaks all of us.
Katrin from Germany, who's a producer of biogas, has a question for you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to relate to this question, because how can we get this movement happening? And you have the experience with 350.org. Maybe you can explain a little bit, how did you start and how did you get this pick up and have this movement happening?
Well, we were lucky, Katrin, in a certain way, because when we started 350.org, it was a wide open space. This was 2008 or 2009. And so we had a kind of unfilled ecological niche that allowed us to spread very quickly around the world. We've organized 20,000 demonstrations in every country on earth except North Korea. We also had the advantage that the fossil fuel industry didn't take us seriously for a while, and so took them a while to figure out how to push back. Trust me, they've gotten good at it. I've had, endured years when the fossil fuel industry paid people to follow me around with a camera every single time I stepped out my door so that they could show videotape of me sitting in church just to prove they could. And obviously, I've had it much easier than people in places around the world where it's easier to intimidate and kill. I got to lead the memorial service at Glasgow last fall for the 230 environmentalists killed around the world last year. So in order to build movements, you need, I think, to give people a sense of agency, a sense that there's some plausible way to connect what they're doing with the change that they want to see. And as I say, that's hard to do sort of one light bulb at a time, because most of us intuit that won't add up quickly enough. And so you have to find ways to engage people. At the moment, as we do this work at Third Act, we're really focused on standing up to the banks that are supplying the capital that allows the fossil fuel industry to continue to expand. And we know a lot more about it than we did even a few months ago. Remarkable new study demonstrating the effect of cash on carbon. I wrote about it in the New Yorker the week before last, and it's truly compelling. It turns out that because if you put money in the mainstream American or European banking system, it's quickly lent out to build pipelines or whatever, the multiplication effects are enormous. When you use this new algorithm to calculate carbon emissions, Google's carbon emissions go up 111% overnight. Microsoft's 170%, I think. Netflix generates more carbon from the cash it has on hand in the banking system than it does from everybody around the world watching bad movies on their sofa every night. Amazon, more carbon from its cash than all its delivery vans and warehouses the world around. And individual Americans, if they have $125,000 in the bank, generate more carbon from that than they do from all the activities of a normal American life, all the flying, cooking, heating, driving, cooling that goes on in the course of a year. So that becomes a very plausible target. It's easier to explain to people why it's important that, say, they cut up their credit cards. We've had beginning to have lots of demonstrations outside those banks. And young people often in the lead, but lots of us older people backing them up from behind. We were marching last week under a big banner that said, "Fossils against fossil fuels."
I can't resist one last question, and it's related to your latest book. But you're speaking here to a room full of people from all around the world, and I want to ask you, speaking as an American, it's not intended as a political question so much as a pragmatic question, but the US has been out of Paris and back into Paris. It now has a US climate envoy who's been working very hard to leverage help from other countries to achieve some of these targets. But what role do you see for the US going ahead, and do you think other countries should rely on a consistent role from the US going ahead?
America's political system is clearly fairly broken. And truthfully, that's been the case for most of the global warming era, at least when it comes to this issue. If you think about it, the reason that the best we've ever done internationally is the entirely voluntary set of agreements we reached at Paris. The reason for that is American political dysfunction. That is, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, key diplomats figured out that there was no chance that there would ever be a treaty that would get 2/3 of the votes in the US Senate. And so it was useless to propose treaties like the one we had in Kyoto. And instead, we had to work out this elaborate system of voluntary agreements enforced by shame, if anything. Nothing's going to markedly change the difficulty of acting in the US. The grip of the fossil fuel industry on our political system is very large. And that's one of the reasons why, though we continue to push hard for political change, we also push hard on the financial system, which is the only other lever big enough to matter. There's two levers here. One's marked politics, one's marked money. We tend to concentrate on the one marked politics because it's just kind of where our mind turns. But political power in America has ended up mostly in the red states. We have a set of archaic laws about, that give Wyoming as many senators as California, on and on and on. Money, however, has tended to accumulate in blue states. 65% of the GDP comes from counties that voted for Biden. And the same is kind of true around the world. If political power is increasingly in the hands of autocrats, Xi Jinping, Bolsonaro, Modi, Erdogan, Putin, so on, Trump, money remains in places where we can press it. New York, London, Frankfurt, Tokyo. So that may be as good a survival strategy for making change rapidly as we're going to get. And it's why I've been to, right at the beginning of the pandemic, and my last trip out before the pandemic was going to jail for sitting in the lobby of the Chase Bank nearest the nation's capital. And I have a feeling it won't be the last time that I make a journey like that. And hopefully with more and more people behind us.
We were very glad that we were able to welcome you and you're not in jail right now. Bill McKibben, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. Thanks.